Have they ever told you the real story of how Jesus died? The one that does not appear in church sermons. The one that has been hidden for 2,000 years. Let me tell you something that is going to change everything you thought you knew. What they taught you in Sunday school, what you heard from priests and pastors, what you read in those beautiful illustrated Bibles, that is not the complete truth. And today, in this video, you are going to discover something that will shake you to your core. You are going to learn what Spinoza found in a forbidden manuscript, a document that reveals who really killed Jesus. And I promise you, it is not who they told you it was. Now I know what you are thinking. You are thinking this is just another conspiracy theory. You are thinking I am about to waste your time with some crazy speculation. But hold on. What I am about to share with you is based on historical documents, on ancient texts, on research that scholars have been afraid to talk about publicly. Spinoza risked everything to reveal this truth. He was excommunicated, he was cursed, he lost his family, his community, his livelihood. Why? Because what he discovered was too dangerous, too threatening to the powers that built their empires on a lie. Here is what we are going to do in this video. First, I am going to show you the contradictions in the story you were told, the things that never made sense but nobody wanted you to question. Then, I am going to reveal what the historical documents actually say when you read them without the filter of religious dogma. And finally, at the very end, I am going to share with you the contents of that forbidden manuscript, the one that changes everything, the revelation that explains why Jesus really died and who was truly responsible. And I warn you, when you hear it, your entire understanding of Christianity will never be the same. But listen carefully. This video is not for everyone. This is not for people who want to keep living with their eyes closed. This is not for people who are afraid of the truth. This is only for those who are ready to see reality, even if it hurts, even if it destroys beliefs you have held your entire life, even if it makes you angry or uncomfortable. Because the truth does not care about your comfort. The truth just is, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So, if you are ready, if you have the courage to question everything you were taught, then stay with me. Do not click away. Do not scroll to another video, because what comes next will change your life. And before we begin, do me a favor, leave a comment below and tell me what country you are watching from. I want to know how far this message is reaching. I want to know that there are people all over the world who are ready to wake up and see the truth. Are you one of them? Let us find out. Now imagine this. Imagine you find an ancient document, a manuscript that has been hidden for centuries, and when you finally read it, you discover that everything they told you about the most important event in Christian history was edited. It was changed. It was rewritten to protect the real criminals, to hide the real murderers. That is exactly what happened to Spinoza, and when he tried to tell people what he found, they destroyed him for it. But his discovery survived, and today I am giving it to you. Let me take you back to a moment that changed everything. Picture this. You are a philosopher living in Amsterdam in the 1600s. You have spent years studying ancient texts, learning dead languages, searching for truth. And then one day, you find it. You find a document that has somehow survived centuries of book burnings, centuries of church censorship, centuries of deliberate destruction. A manuscript that tells a completely different story about the crucifixion. A story that makes the powerful very, very nervous. This is not fiction. This is not some made-up tale. This is what actually happened to Baruch Spinoza. And when he read that manuscript, when he understood what it meant, he knew his life would never be the same. Because what he held in his hands was proof. Proof that the story we have been told for 2,000 years was carefully edited. It was modified. It was changed to serve a political purpose, to protect certain people, to blame others, to build an empire of control on top of a dead man's body. Now you already know that Spinoza was excommunicated. You already know that the Jewish community of Amsterdam put a curse on him so severe that his own family would not speak to him. You already know that he was banned, shunned, forced to live in poverty, forced to grind lenses for a living just to survive. But here is what most people do not know. Here is what the history books leave out. Spinoza did not just question religion from a philosophical perspective. He did not just sit in his room thinking abstract thoughts. No, he investigated. He researched. He dug into the actual historical evidence. Spinoza learned Hebrew fluently. He learned Aramaic, the language Jesus actually spoke. He learned Greek, the language the New Testament was written in. He learned Latin, the language of the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. And he did not learn these languages to worship. He learnt them to understand, to read the original texts without relying on translations that had been filtered through centuries of church interpretation, to see what the words actually said before priests told people what they were supposed to mean. And during this investigation, during this search for truth, something remarkable happened. Spinoza discovered a manuscript, a text that had somehow escaped the purges. You see, throughout history, the church did not just burn heretics. They burned books. They burned documents. They burned anything that contradicted the official narrative. Entire libraries were destroyed. Thousands of ancient texts were lost forever. But somehow, some documents survived, hidden in private collections, copied by brave scribes who knew they were risking their lives, passed down secretly from one generation to the next. This manuscript that Spinoza found was one of those survivors, and what it contained was explosive. It told a version of the crucifixion that was raw, unfiltered, and completely different from what appears in the four Gospels. It did not have the theological polish of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It did not have the carefully constructed narrative that places all the blame on the Jewish people and makes the Romans look like reluctant executioners. Instead, it told the story the way it actually happened, with all the messy political calculations, with all the human cowardice, with all the institutional corruption. But before I tell you what that manuscript said, you need to understand something. You need to understand why the official story of the death of Jesus never made complete sense in the first place. You need to understand the contradictions that have always been there, hiding in plain sight. The questions that your Sunday school teacher could not answer. The parts of the story that never quite added up. Because once you see these contradictions, once you start asking the right questions, the whole official narrative begins to fall apart. And that is when the truth starts to emerge. That is when you begin to see what really happened on that hill outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Let me ask you something. Have you ever really thought about the story of how Jesus died? I mean, really thought about it. Not just accepted it because that is what you were taught, but actually examined it with a critical mind? Because when you do, when you start asking basic questions, the whole thing starts to look very strange, very suspicious, very much like a story that was changed to serve someone's purpose. Let us start with the Romans. The Roman Empire crucified people all the time. It was their favorite method of execution for rebels, for slaves, for anyone who challenged their authority. Crucifixion was not just a death penalty. It was a public spectacle, a warning. The Romans would line the roads with crosses, displaying the bodies of crucified criminals so that everyone who passed by would see what happens when you defy Rome. Historians estimate that the Romans crucified tens of thousands of people during their rule, maybe hundreds of thousands. They did not hesitate, they did not feel guilty, they just killed. So here is my question. Why would these same Romans, who crucified rebels by the dozens without a second thought, suddenly become so interested in a carpenter from a small town called Nazareth? What made Jesus so special to them? What made him such a threat? The Bible tells us that Jesus was a peaceful teacher who talked about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. So why did Rome care? Why did they bother to execute him at all? And here is an even stranger question. Why does the Bible portray Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who ordered the crucifixion, as a good man, as someone who did not really want to kill Jesus. In the Gospel accounts, Pilate appears almost sympathetic. He questions Jesus. He finds no fault in him. He tries to release him. He even washes his hands in front of the crowd and says he is innocent of this man's blood. He makes it seem like the whole thing was forced upon him, like he had no choice, like the real villains were the Jewish priests and the Jewish crowd who demanded Jesus' death. Does that not seem strange to you? Does that not seem like a very convenient way to tell the story? The Roman governor, the man with all the power, the man who could execute or free anyone he wanted, is painted as a victim of circumstance, while the Jewish people, who had no political power, who lived under Roman occupation, are made to look like the bloodthirsty murderers. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. Now let me tell you something about the real Pontius Pilate, something the Bible does not mention. Outside of the New Testament, in the actual historical records from that time period, Pilate is described very differently. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived during that era, writes about Pilate, and so does Philo of Alexandria, another contemporary writer. And what do they say? They describe Pilate as brutal, as cruel, as violent, as someone who had no problem killing Jews whenever he felt like it. Philo writes that Pilate was known for his corruption, his violence, his robberies, his habit of insulting people, his frequent executions of prisoners without trial. Josephus tells us that Pilate provoked the Jews deliberately. He brought Roman military standards with images of the emperor into Jerusalem, knowing it would offend Jewish religious sensibilities. When the Jews protested peacefully, Pilate threatened to have his soldiers slaughter them all. He massacred Samaritans who gathered on a mountain for religious purposes, claiming they were plotting rebellion. He was eventually recalled to Rome and removed from his position because even by Roman standards, his brutality was excessive. This is the real Pilate, a man who killed without hesitation, a man who saw Jewish lives as worthless, a man who would crucify someone for looking at him wrong. So tell me, does it make sense that this same man would suddenly develop a conscience when it came to Jesus? Does it make sense that he would wash his hands and say he wanted nothing to do with this execution? Does it make sense that he would try to release Jesus and only kill him because the Jewish crowd pressured him into it? Of course, it does not make sense. It is absurd. It is a complete contradiction. And yet, this is the story that billions of people have believed for 2,000 years. This is the story that has been used to justify hatred, persecution, and violence against Jewish people for centuries, all based on a portrayal of Pilate that is completely inconsistent with who he actually was. So why? Why was the story told this way? Why make the Romans look innocent? Why make the Jews look guilty? To answer that question, you need to understand when the Gospels were written. You need to understand the political situation at the time. Because the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. They were not written during Jesus' lifetime. They were not even written immediately after his death. They were written decades later in a very specific historical context. And that context shaped everything about how the story was told. The four Gospels that you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written by people who actually witnessed the events. They were not written by the disciples who walked with Jesus. They were not written during Jesus' lifetime or even shortly after his death. These are facts that most Christians do not know because nobody tells them. But the facts are clear when you actually study the historical evidence. The Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest of the four, was written around the year 70. That is approximately 40 years after Jesus died. Matthew and Luke were written sometime between the years 80 and 90. That is 50 to 60 years after the crucifixion. And the Gospel of John was written around the year 100, which is roughly 70 years after Jesus' death. Think about that, 70 years. If Jesus died today, it would be like someone in the year 2095 writing down what they heard happened. How accurate do you think that would be? How many details would be lost? How many stories would be changed in the retelling? But here is what is even more important. You need to understand what was happening during those years when the Gospels were being written, because the political situation during that time shaped everything about how the story was told. It determined who would be blamed and who would be protected. It determined which parts of the truth would be kept and which parts would be edited out. In the year 66, just a few decades after Jesus died, something major happened. The Jewish people in Judea rebelled against Roman rule. This was not a small protest. This was a full-scale war. The Jews were tired of living under Roman occupation. They were tired of paying taxes to Caesar. They were tired of Roman soldiers in their streets and Roman governors making their laws. So they fought back. They attacked Roman garrisons. They took control of Jerusalem. They thought they could win their freedom, but Rome does not lose. Rome does not forgive rebellion, and Rome does not show mercy. The Emperor Nero sent his best general, Vespasian, with a massive army to crush the Jewish revolt. And they did exactly that. It was brutal. It was merciless. It was total destruction. In the year 70, Roman forces surrounded Jerusalem. They besieged the city, they starved the people, and then they broke through the walls and slaughtered everyone they could find. The Romans destroyed the Jewish temple, the holiest site in Judaism, the center of Jewish religious life. They burned it to the ground. They killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. Some historians say the death toll was over 1 million. The survivors were sold into slavery or scattered across the empire. The Jewish nation was essentially destroyed. Jerusalem was left in ruins. And the message was clear to everyone in the Roman Empire. This is what happens when you rebel against Rome. Now, here is where it gets really important. The early Christians had a huge problem. Their entire religion was born out of Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. His first followers were Jewish. His teachings were rooted in Jewish scripture. The disciples were Jewish. Everything about early Christianity was deeply connected to Judaism. But now, after the year 70, the Jews were the enemies of Rome. They were rebels. They were traitors. They were dangerous. So imagine you are an early Christian, living in the Roman Empire in the year 80 or 90. You are trying to spread this new religion. You are trying to convince Romans and Greeks and other non-Jewish people to join your movement. But your religion is associated with the Jews, and the Jews just fought a war against Rome and lost catastrophically. How do you survive? How do you grow? How do you avoid being seen as part of that same rebellious, dangerous group? You distance yourself, you separate yourself from the Jews as much as possible. You show the Romans that you are not like them. You show that you are not a threat. You show that you are actually on Rome's side. And the best way to do that is to rewrite the story of what happened to Jesus. You make the Romans look good, you make the Jews look bad. You shift all the blame away from the empire and place it entirely on the Jewish people. And that is exactly what happened. When the gospel writers sat down to tell the story of Jesus' death, they made very specific choices, very calculated choices. They softened the image of Pontius Pilate. They made him seem reluctant, conflicted, even sympathetic. They portrayed the Roman soldiers as just following orders, as neutral parties who had no personal animosity toward Jesus. They reduced Rome's responsibility as much as they possibly could. But the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the priests of the temple, the Sanhedrin council, they became the villains. They became the ones who wanted Jesus dead. They became the ones who conspired against him. They became the ones who manipulated Pilate into ordering the execution. And most damaging of all, they made it seem like the entire Jewish population demanded Jesus' crucifixion. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 25, there is a scene that has caused more suffering than almost any other verse in the Bible. Pilate washes his hands and declares that he is innocent of Jesus' blood. And then the crowd, the Jewish crowd, responds by saying, "His blood be on us and on our children." Think about what that means. The gospel writer puts words in the mouths of the Jewish people where they accept full responsibility for Jesus' death, not just for themselves, but for their children, for all future generations. That one verse has been used to justify 2,000 years of persecution, the pogroms in Europe, where Jewish communities were massacred, the forced conversions, the expulsions, the ghettos, the Inquisition, and yes, even the Holocaust. All of it justified by the claim that the Jews killed Jesus, that they are Christ killers, that they bear eternal guilt, all because of how the story was told in the Gospels, all because the early Christians needed to survive in a Roman world and made the political calculation to blame the Jews and protect the Romans. Do you see the pattern now? Do you see how the story was shaped by politics? Do you see how the historical context determined who would be guilty and who would be innocent? This is not speculation. This is not conspiracy theory. This is what happens when you actually study the history, when you look at the timeline, when you understand what was at stake for the people writing these texts. The Gospels are not objective historical accounts. They are theological documents written with a specific purpose. They were written to spread a religion in a hostile empire. They were written to convert pagans. They were written to distance Christianity from Judaism. And they were written to make sure that Rome, the empire with all the power, would not see Christians as enemies. That is why the story looks the way it does. That is why Pilate is portrayed as a good man. And that is why the Jews are portrayed as murderers. But now comes the part that changes everything. Because what Spinoza discovered was not just that the story was edited. He discovered what the story looked like before it was edited. He found out what actually happened. He uncovered the truth that the gospel writers tried to hide. And when you hear it, when you understand it, you will never read the Bible the same way again. So what did Spinoza discover? What did he find when he analyzed the texts with a clear mind, without religious bias, without the fear of offending anyone? He found something simple, something obvious, something that should have been clear all along, but was buried under centuries of theological manipulation. He found the truth, and the truth is this. The Romans killed Jesus, not because the Jews forced them to, not because Pilate had no choice. The Romans killed Jesus because he was exactly the kind of person they always killed. Let me explain this clearly so there is no confusion. Jesus was not executed because of some cosmic plan. He was not killed to fulfill prophecy. He was not sacrificed by God to save humanity from sin. Those are theological interpretations that came later. Those are stories that were built on top of the historical event to give it religious meaning. But the actual historical fact, the real reason Jesus died, was political. It was brutal, and it was simple. Jesus was a Jewish preacher who traveled around Galilee and Judea talking about the kingdom of God. He said that the last would be first and the first would be last. He said the meek would inherit the earth. He said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. He gathered crowds. He healed people. He challenged the religious authorities. And according to the Gospels themselves, he went into the temple in Jerusalem and physically drove out the merchants and money changers with a whip, overturning their tables and calling the temple a den of thieves. Now put yourself in the position of a Roman governor. You rule over a territory full of Jews who hate being occupied. You know that Jewish prophets and messiahs have started rebellions before. You know that religious movements can quickly turn political. You know that anyone who gathers large crowds and talks about a coming kingdom is dangerous, because when a Jew talks about the kingdom of God, Rome hears the overthrow of the kingdom of Caesar. Jesus called himself, or was called by his followers, the King of the Jews. Do you understand what that means to Rome? That is treason, that is sedition, that is a direct challenge to Caesar's authority. There can only be one king in the Roman Empire, and that is Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king, anyone who allows people to call them a king, is declaring war on Rome. And Rome responds to such declarations with one punishment: crucifixion. Crucifixion was not just an execution method. It was a political statement. It was Rome's way of saying, This is what happens to rebels. This is what happens to anyone who challenges us. They crucified slaves who rebelled. They crucified bandits who disrupted trade. They crucified Jewish zealots who preached revolution, and they crucified anyone who claimed to be the Messiah or a king. Jesus fit perfectly into that category. He was not special to the Romans. He was just another troublemaker who needed to be eliminated. And here is the proof that this is true. When they crucified Jesus, they put a sign above his head. You know what it said? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That sign was not put there by the Jewish people. It was put there by the Romans. It was written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that everyone who passed by could read it. And the message was clear. This man claimed to be a king. This man challenged Rome. This is what happens to people who do that. Pilate did not reluctantly order this execution. He did not wash his hands and claim innocence. Those are details added by the gospel writers decades later to shift blame away from Rome. The real Pilate, the brutal Pilate, the Pilate who killed Jews without hesitation, saw Jesus as a threat and had him crucified, just like he crucified hundreds of others. It was routine for him. It was Tuesday. Another rebel dead. Another warning sent. Nothing special. Nothing worth agonizing over. This is the truth that Spinoza uncovered. The Romans killed Jesus because he was doing exactly what Rome considered criminal. He was preaching about a different kingdom. He was gathering followers. He was disrupting the social order. He was challenging authority. And in Roman law, that was enough. That was all the reason they needed. They did not need the Jews to force their hand. They did not need pressure from the crowd. They had the power, and they used it the way they always used it, with violence, with brutality, with a cross. But here is where the story gets even deeper. Here is where the layers start to peel back and reveal something darker. Because while it is true that the Romans executed Jesus, while it is true that they had the power and they made the decision, there was something else happening. There was complicity from within. There was betrayal from inside the Jewish community itself. And this is what the manuscript that Spinoza found revealed with chilling clarity. The religious authorities in Jerusalem, the priests of the temple, the members of the Sanhedrin Council, they had their own reasons for wanting Jesus gone. Jesus was not just a problem for Rome. He was a problem for them too, maybe an even bigger problem. Because while Rome saw him as a political threat, the religious leaders saw him as a threat to their power, their wealth, their control over the people, and they were willing to cooperate with Rome to get rid of him. Let me ask you a question. Who benefited the most from Jesus' death? Think about it carefully. The Romans? Not really. They executed one more rebel. Life went on. They did not gain anything special from it. But the Jewish religious authorities, they gained everything. They got rid of someone who was calling them hypocrites in public, someone who was exposing their corruption, someone who was turning the people against them, someone who threatened their entire system. Jesus did not speak kindly about the Pharisees and the priests. He called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead bones on the inside. He accused them of placing heavy burdens on the people while not lifting a finger to help. He said they made long prayers in public for show while devouring widows' houses. He called them blind guides and snakes. He said they had turned the house of God into a marketplace where religion was bought and sold. These were not minor criticisms. These were direct attacks on their legitimacy. And here is something that is actually in the Bible, but nobody explains it properly. In the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 49 and 50, there is a meeting of the Sanhedrin. They are discussing what to do about Jesus. And Caiaphas, the high priest, says something very revealing. He says, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." Read that carefully. Caiaphas is not talking about spiritual salvation. He is not talking about atonement for sins. He is talking about political calculation. He is talking about survival. He is saying that if Jesus keeps preaching, if he keeps gathering crowds, if he keeps causing trouble, then Rome might crack down on all of them. Rome might destroy the temple. Rome might remove them from power. So it is better, it is more convenient, it is strategically smart to eliminate Jesus before things get worse. This is a conspiracy. This is premeditated murder justified by political necessity. And it shows that the religious authorities were not passive victims. They were not forced into anything. They actively wanted Jesus dead because his message threatened their position. They saw him as dangerous to their authority, dangerous to their business, dangerous to their comfortable arrangement with Rome. So what really happened was this. The religious authorities identified Jesus as a problem. They marked him as dangerous. They brought charges against him to Pilate, and they framed those charges in political terms that Rome would care about. They did not tell Pilate that Jesus criticized their interpretation of religious law. Rome would not care about that. Instead, they said he was claiming to be a king. They said he was telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar. They said he was inciting rebellion. Those were charges that Pilate had to respond to. And Pilate, who never needed much convincing to kill a Jew, ordered the crucifixion. It was a coordinated assassination. The religious authorities and the political authorities working together, both sides benefiting. The priests got rid of a troublemaker who threatened their power, Rome got rid of a potential rebel who threatened their control, and Jesus died on a cross with a sign above his head declaring him a king, a warning to anyone else who might think about challenging the system. That is the truth. That is what Spinoza discovered when he read the texts without the filter of church doctrine. That is what the historical evidence shows when you actually look at it honestly. Jesus was killed by a collaboration between religious power and imperial power. It was political, it was calculated, it was murder dressed up as justice. And for 2,000 years, the church has told a different story, to protect the guilty and blame the innocent. But the story does not end there. What Spinoza found in that forbidden manuscript went even deeper. It revealed something that the church could never admit, something that would destroy the entire foundation of Christian martyrdom and heroism, something that shows the crucifixion was not just a conspiracy between Rome and the temple priests. It was also a story of human weakness, of cowardice, of betrayal, from the very people who claimed to love Jesus the most. The manuscript that Spinoza discovered was a letter. It was written by an anonymous follower of Jesus, someone who had been there, someone who had witnessed the events firsthand. And unlike the Gospels that were written decades later with theological agendas, this letter was raw. It was honest. It was written shortly after the crucifixion, when the pain was still fresh, when the guilt was still overwhelming, when there was no time yet to construct a heroic narrative. It was just the truth, ugly and human and devastating. Let me read you what it said. The writer begins by describing their expectations. We believed he would free us from the Roman yoke. We thought he was the Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Israel. We followed him because we believed he would lead us to victory, that he would drive out the occupiers, that he would make us a free nation again. But we did not understand. We did not understand that his kingdom was not of this world. We did not understand that he was not going to raise armies, or seize power, or fight Rome with swords. Can you hear the disappointment in those words? Can you hear the disillusionment? These people followed Jesus expecting a military leader, a revolutionary, a king who would liberate them from Roman occupation. But Jesus kept talking about love and forgiveness and turning the other cheek. He kept saying his kingdom was spiritual, not political. He kept refusing to be the warrior Messiah they wanted him to be. And slowly, gradually, some of his followers started to lose faith. The letter continues. When we saw that he would not take up arms, when we realized he was not going to fight, some of us began to doubt. Some of us began to think we had made a mistake. Some of us began to wonder if we had wasted years following a dreamer instead of a leader. And when the priests came to us, when they started asking questions, when they started making offers, some of us listened. Do you understand what this means? It means that the betrayal was not just Judas. It was not just one bad disciple who sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. The betrayal was wider. The betrayal was deeper. Multiple followers, multiple people in Jesus' inner circle, were approached by the religious authorities, and some of them cooperated, some of them gave information, some of them stayed silent when they should have spoken, some of them chose their own safety over their loyalty to Jesus. The manuscript becomes even more painful. The priests offered us protection. They said if we kept quiet, if we did not cause trouble, if we let events unfold without interference, they would make sure we were not arrested. They would make sure our families were safe. They would let us live in peace. And the Romans made it clear that anyone who associated with a rebel, anyone who defended a man accused of sedition, would share his fate. They would be crucified alongside him. This is the truth that nobody wants to hear. This is the truth that destroys the image of the brave disciples who stood by Jesus no matter what. The reality was that most of them were terrified. Most of them were ordinary people with families, with lives, with things to lose. And when it came down to it, when they had to choose between dying on a cross with Jesus or living by staying silent, they chose life. They chose silence. They chose self-preservation. The letter writer confesses this with brutal honesty. We chose to live. We chose the safety they offered. We chose to believe that maybe it was better this way. Maybe it was God's will. Maybe Jesus had to die. We told ourselves these things to make the guilt easier to bear, but the truth is simpler and more terrible. We were cowards. We abandoned him when he needed us most, and he died alone. Alone. Think about that word. Jesus did not die surrounded by his faithful disciples. He did not die with a crowd of supporters defending him. According to the Gospels themselves, all his disciples fled when he was arrested. Peter, the rock upon which Jesus said he would build his church, denied even knowing Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. The others scattered. They hid. They disappeared into the shadows. And Jesus went to his death with no one standing beside him. But the manuscript reveals that it was worse than just running away out of fear. It reveals that some of the disciples were complicit. They knew what was going to happen. They knew the priests and the Romans were planning to arrest Jesus, and they did nothing. They said nothing. They made the calculation that it was better to let one man die than to risk their own lives. Does that sound familiar? It should. It is the exact same logic that Caiaphas used. It is better that one man dies than that we all suffer. The letter ends with a confession of guilt that is almost unbearable to read. Now he is gone. Now he is dead, and we are alive. We survived, but at what cost? The guilt we carry is heavier than any punishment Rome could inflict. The shame we feel is worse than any curse the priests could pronounce. We tell ourselves we had no choice. We tell ourselves anyone would have done the same. But late at night, when sleep will not come, we know the truth. We could have stood with him. We could have spoken for him. We could have refused to cooperate. We could have been brave, but we were not. And that knowledge, that terrible knowledge, will haunt us until we die. This is what Spinoza found. This is what the manuscript revealed. The crucifixion was not just a story of evil Romans and corrupt priests murdering an innocent man. It was also a story of human weakness. It was a story of fear overcoming faith. It was a story of ordinary people making the choice to survive at the expense of someone they claimed to love. It was not just Judas who betrayed Jesus. It was not just the religious authorities. It was not just the Roman government. It was everyone. It was the whole system. It was human nature itself, choosing safety over truth, choosing comfort over courage, choosing life over loyalty. And this is precisely why the church could never allow this manuscript to become public. Because if people knew this, if people understood that the first followers of Jesus were complicit in his death, that they were cowards who abandoned him, that they chose their own lives over his, then the entire structure of Christian authority would collapse. How could the church claim to be built on the foundation of the apostles if the apostles were guilty? How could they demand obedience from believers if their own founders were too weak to stand up for what they believed? How could they point to the disciples as examples of faith when the disciples failed at the crucial moment? The answer is simple. They could not. So the manuscript had to disappear. So the story had to be changed. So the narrative had to become one of heroic martyrs and faithful witnesses, even though the truth was far more complicated and far more human. The disciples became saints in the official story, but in reality they were just people, scared people, weak people, people who made terrible choices and lived with terrible guilt. And here is what makes this revelation so powerful, so important, so necessary for you to understand. If the founders of Christianity were complicit, if they were flawed, if they were cowards who failed at the moment of truth, then what authority do their successors have? What right does the church have to judge you? What basis do they have to demand your obedience? What claim do they have to moral superiority? The answer is none. They have no more authority than you do. They have no special connection to God that you lack. They are just people, flawed, scared, self-serving people who built an institution on top of a dead man's body and told stories that made themselves look better than they were. This is why Spinoza was attacked so viciously for revealing this truth. This is why the manuscript was suppressed for centuries. This is why you were never taught this in Sunday school or church. Because the truth is too uncomfortable. The truth is too human. The truth is too real. It shows that the entire foundation of religious authority is built on a lie. Not the lie that Jesus existed or that he taught important things, but the lie that the people who came after him were somehow special, somehow chosen, somehow more worthy than you are. Now you might be wondering, if all of this is true, if the disciples were complicit, if the story was edited for political reasons, if the real killers were the Romans and the religious authorities working together, then how did we end up with the version of Christianity that exists today? How did a story of political murder become a story of divine sacrifice? How did human weakness and institutional corruption transform into a theology of salvation? The answer is both simple and sinister. They turned the death of Jesus into a tool of control. Let me explain how this works. After Jesus died, after the disciples scattered in shame and guilt, something had to happen. The movement could have ended right there. It could have been just another failed messianic movement, another group of Jews who thought they had found their liberator but were disappointed. There were many such movements in first-century Judea. Most of them disappeared after their leaders were killed, but this one survived. Why? Because the people who came after, the people who built the church, realized something crucial. They realized that they could use Jesus' death not as a defeat but as the centerpiece of a new religion. But to do that, they needed to change what the death meant. They could not admit it was a political assassination. They could not admit that Jesus died because he threatened powerful people. They could not admit that his own followers abandoned him out of cowardice. That would make the whole thing look like a tragedy, like a failure, like a waste. So instead, they reframed it. They turned it into theology. They made it cosmic. They made it necessary. They made it part of God's plan. And here is how they did it. They took an old Jewish concept, the idea of sacrifice for sin, and they applied it to Jesus' death. They said that humanity was inherently sinful, that every person who has ever lived was born corrupted, born guilty, born deserving of punishment.
They called it original sin. The idea that because Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, every single human being who came after them inherited their guilt. You did not do anything wrong. You were just born. But according to this theology, you are guilty anyway. You are a sinner from the moment you take your first breath. And what is the punishment for sin? Death, eternal death, separation from God, hell. That is what you deserve, they said. That is what every human being deserves. But here is the good news, they said. Here is the salvation. God loved you so much that he sent his own son to die in your place. Jesus took the punishment that you deserved. He died so that you could live. His blood washed away your sins. His sacrifice paid the debt you owed. All you have to do is believe. All you have to do is accept him. All you have to do is be grateful. Do you see what they did? They took a political murder and turned it into a gift. They took a brutal execution and made it into love. They made you responsible for his death, even though you were not there, even though you did not do anything, even though it happened 2,000 years before you were born. They created a debt that you could never repay. They made you guilty of killing God's son. And then they offered you forgiveness, but only on their terms, only if you obey, only if you submit, only if you accept their authority. This is the most brilliant system of control ever invented. Think about it. You are told that you are born guilty. You did not choose this. You did not do anything to deserve it, but you are guilty anyway. And not just guilty of some minor offense. You are guilty of the worst crime imaginable. You killed the Son of God. Your sins, your very existence, made his death necessary. If you had not been a sinner, he would not have had to suffer. If humanity had not been corrupt, he would not have needed to die. So his torture, his humiliation, his crucifixion, that is on you. That is your fault. And what does this guilt do to a person? It makes them feel small. It makes them feel unworthy. It makes them feel like they owe something, like they are in debt to an institution that claims to represent the man who died for them. It makes them obedient. It makes them afraid to question, because if you question the church, if you challenge the doctrine, if you refuse to submit, then you are being ungrateful. You are spitting on the sacrifice. You are rejecting the gift of salvation. And that makes you not just wrong, but evil, not just mistaken, but damned. The church understood that if you can make people feel guilty enough, if you can make them feel like they are inherently broken and only you have the cure, then you can control them completely. You can tell them what to believe. You can tell them how to behave. You can tell them who to vote for, who to hate, who to exclude. You can take their money and tell them it is for God. You can abuse their children and tell them to stay silent. You can commit atrocities and tell them it is justified, because they believe they need you. They believe they cannot access God without you. They believe their salvation depends on your approval. And when people start to question, when they start to see the contradictions, when they notice that the story does not quite make sense, the church has a ready answer. Mystery. You cannot understand it, they say. It is beyond human comprehension. God works in mysterious ways. You are too small, too sinful, too limited to grasp the divine plan. You just need to have faith. You just need to believe. Stop asking questions. Stop thinking so much. Just trust us. We are the experts. We have the authority. We know what God wants and you do not. This is how control works: through guilt, through fear, through mystery, through the claim of exclusive access to truth. They tell you that Jesus died for your sins, that you carry a debt from birth, that you owe eternal gratitude for a sacrifice you never asked for. They tell you that suffering is holy, that carrying your cross is a duty, that questioning is a sin. They build a whole system where obedience is virtue and independence is rebellion. But here is what Spinoza saw. Here is what he tried to show people. Jesus did not need to die to make you worthy. You were always worthy. From the moment you were born, you had value, you had dignity, you had the right to exist without guilt, without shame, without owing anyone anything. Jesus died because powerful people felt threatened by his message of love without conditions, justice for the poor, freedom from religious oppression. He died because the system, both political and religious, could not tolerate someone who taught people they did not need intermediaries to connect with the divine. The church took that death and inverted its meaning. Jesus died challenging authority, and they used his death to enforce authority. Jesus died preaching freedom, and they used his death to create bondage. Jesus died offering unconditional love, and they used his death to create conditional acceptance. That is the real betrayal, not Judas selling him out for silver, not the disciples running away in fear. The real betrayal was turning his message into its opposite. The real betrayal was building exactly the kind of religious system that Jesus criticized. The real betrayal was using his corpse as the foundation of an empire of control. And you sitting there right now, carrying guilt that was deliberately placed on you, guilt that you inherited from centuries of manipulation, you need to hear this clearly. You are not responsible for the death of Jesus. You were not born in sin. You do not owe obedience to an institution that built itself on his murder. You do not need priests or pastors or popes to connect you with whatever you consider divine. If the message of Jesus resonates with you, if the ideas of love and justice and compassion speak to your heart, then live them. But do not live them out of fear. Do not live them out of guilt. Do not live them to earn heaven or avoid hell. Live them because they make you a better person. Live them because they make the world a better place. Live them because they align with your own moral understanding, not because someone told you that you have to. So now we arrive at the final revelation, the one that changes everything, the one that makes sense of this entire journey we have taken together. You came here to learn about the hidden assassination of Jesus. You wanted to know who really killed him, and I have shown you. The Romans executed him because he was a political threat. The religious authorities conspired with Rome because he threatened their power. His own followers abandoned him out of fear and cowardice. That is the historical truth that was hidden, edited, and buried under centuries of theological interpretation. But here is the deeper truth. Here is the revelation that Spinoza ultimately wanted you to understand. The greatest assassination in history was not just the crucifixion of a man 2,000 years ago. Yes, that was a murder. Yes, that was a brutal political execution. Yes, that was a conspiracy between religious and imperial power. But that was just one man dying on one cross. The greatest assassination, the one that has affected billions of people across 2 millennia, was the assassination of his message, the killing of his vision, the destruction of what he actually stood for. Jesus preached love without conditions. He said, love your enemies. He said, forgive 70 times 7. He said, do not judge others. He said, the kingdom of God is within you. He touched lepers. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. He defended the woman caught in adultery. He elevated the poor, the sick, the marginalized, the outcast. He said that how you treat the least among you is how you treat God. His message was radical inclusion, radical compassion, radical equality. It was love without control, love without hierarchy, love without institutional mediation. And what did the church do with that message? They killed it. They took his words about freedom and turned them into rules. They took his message of love and turned it into judgment. They took his criticism of religious authorities and became religious authorities themselves. They took his inclusion of outcasts and created new outcasts. They took his command to feed the poor and built palaces of gold. They took his teaching about the kingdom within and told people they needed priests and rituals and sacraments to access God. They murdered his message as surely as the Romans murdered his body. That is the real crime. That is the real assassination. They took a man who died challenging religious control and used his death to create the most powerful religious control system in human history. They took a teacher who said, you are already worthy, and built a doctrine that says you are born guilty. They took someone who preached liberation and built an empire of oppression. And they have been getting away with it for 2,000 years because most people never question the story they were told. But you are questioning it now. You are seeing it now. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand that the entire structure was built on a distortion, on a deliberate inversion of what Jesus actually taught, you are faced with a choice. You can go back to believing the comfortable lie. You can pretend you never heard this. You can return to the guilt and the fear and the obedience, or you can choose freedom, real freedom, not the fake freedom of I am a sinner saved by grace, real freedom. The freedom to live without guilt you did not earn, the freedom to love without fear of judgment, the freedom to think without being told you are too sinful to understand, the freedom to be human without needing permission from an institution. And here is what that freedom looks like. If Jesus' message speaks to you, if his teachings about love and justice and compassion resonate with your heart, then live them, but live them in their original form, not the corrupted version the church sold you. Love people unconditionally. That means love them without trying to convert them, without judging their lifestyle, without making your acceptance dependent on their belief. Jesus ate with sinners. He did not eat with them to fix them. He ate with them because they were human beings worthy of dignity and companionship. Seek justice for the poor and the oppressed. That means actually work for systemic change, actually challenge power structures that exploit people, actually stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Do not just pray for the poor. Do not just feel sorry for them. Take action, use your voice, use your vote, use your resources. Jesus did not just feel bad for the oppressed. He confronted their oppressors. He called them out publicly. He disrupted their systems. That is what seeking justice actually means. Forgive people. Real forgiveness, not the kind where you hold grudges while claiming you have forgiven, not the kind where you keep bringing up past hurts, not the kind where you make someone grovel and beg before you grant them your mercy. Forgive the way Jesus described forgiveness, freely, completely, without keeping score, because forgiveness is not a gift you give to others. It is a gift you give yourself. It is freedom from the prison of resentment. But do not do any of this because you are afraid of hell. Do not do it because you think God is watching and keeping track of your good deeds. Do not do it to earn points toward heaven. Do not do it out of religious obligation. Do it because it is the right way to live. Do it because it makes you feel whole. Do it because it connects you to your shared humanity. Do it because when you help someone else, you help yourself. When you love someone else, you experience love. When you give dignity to others, you affirm your own dignity. This is what Spinoza understood. This is what he tried to teach. You do not need religion to be moral. Morality does not come from fear of punishment or hope of reward. Morality comes from understanding that you are connected to everything that exists, that what you do to others, you do to yourself, that we are all part of the same existence, the same reality, the same web of life. When you hurt someone, you hurt yourself. When you help someone, you help yourself, not because God is going to reward or punish you, but because that is how reality works. So that is how ethics works when you strip away all the supernatural threats and promises. Jesus taught this. He said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He said, love your neighbor as yourself, not because God commands it, not because you will get into heaven, but because your neighbor is yourself. You are connected. You are part of the same human family. What happens to them matters to you because you are not separate. This is the teaching that the church, buried under layers of sin and salvation and sacrifice. And now I am giving it back to you, not as a new dogma, not as a new set of rules you must follow, but as an invitation, as a possibility, as a door that has always been there, but you were told you could not open it without permission from priests and pastors. The door is open. You can walk through it. You can live without guilt. You can love without fear. You can think without restriction. You can be fully human without needing any institution to validate your humanity. This is the resurrection that matters, not some mystical event 2,000 years ago where a corpse came back to life. The resurrection that matters is you waking up, you coming back to life after being dead inside from years of guilt and fear and religious manipulation. you discovering that you are always free, always worthy, always enough. That is the resurrection. That is the rebirth. That is the salvation. And it does not require believing anything supernatural. It just requires seeing the truth and choosing to live in alignment with it. The greatest assassination in history was not the murder of Jesus's body, it was the murder of his message. But you can resurrect that message. You can bring it back to life, not by joining a church or reciting creeds or performing rituals, but by living it, by loving without conditions, by seeking justice without compromise, by forgiving without keeping score, by thinking without fear, by being human without apology. That is what Spinoza discovered. That is what he shared at tremendous personal cost. He was excommunicated. He was cursed. He lost everything, but his ideas survived because truth always survives. You can try to bury it. You can try to burn it. You can try to silence everyone who speaks it, but eventually someone will dig it up. Someone will remember. Someone will have the courage to say what everyone else is afraid to say. And today, I am saying it to you. You are free. You always were. You just did not know it because they spent your whole life telling you that you were not. So what are you going to do with this freedom? Are you going to go back to the comfortable prison of religious guilt? Or are you going to step through that open door and live like a free person? The choice is yours. It always has been. They just convinced you that you did not have a choice, but you do. And making that choice, claiming that freedom, living without the weight of guilt you never deserved, that is how you honor what Jesus actually taught, not by worshiping him, not by building churches in his name, but by living the message that got him killed. Love without control, justice without compromise, freedom without permission. If these words have resonated with you, if something inside you has woken up, if you feel like finally someone said what you always suspected but were afraid to think, then do not keep it to yourself. Give this video a like so that more people can find it, so that more people can discover that they do not have to carry guilt that was never theirs. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep uncovering the truths that have been hidden, keep questioning the narratives that demand blind obedience, keep growing together in understanding and freedom. And leave a comment answering this question. What hidden truth about your religion would you like us to explore next? Your curiosity can open doors for others. Your courage to ask questions can give others permission to ask their own questions. Spinoza lost everything for speaking the truth, but his ideas survived because truth always survives. And today I am handing that truth to you, not as a final answer that you must accept without question, but as a tool for thinking, a tool for investigating, a tool for discovering your own truth. Question everything I have said. Do not just believe me because I said it. Investigate, read, think for yourself, look at the historical evidence, read the Gospels with critical eyes, study what scholars who are not bound by religious doctrine have discovered, make up your own mind. That is freedom. That is honesty. That is what it means to live with your eyes open instead of closed. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having the courage to listen all the way to the end. Thank you for being willing to look at history from a different angle, to consider possibilities you were told not to consider, to think thoughts you were told not to think. The greatest assassination in history was not just a cross on Golgotha. It was the burial of truth. It was the construction of a control system on top of a dead man's body. But you can refuse to be part of that system anymore. You can choose freedom. You can choose truth. You can choose to live without fear. That choice, that freedom, that is your right. It always was. If this journey has been revelatory for you, I invite you to join this community. We will continue uncovering hidden truths together. Your voice in the comments is essential. Dialogue is the only path to truth. Until next time, remember this: you are not guilty, you are not broken, you do not need anyone's permission to be whole. You are always free. Now go live like it.